Hello and welcome to another episode of the Family Renewal Podcast. I'm Israel Wayne, and today I have a guest that I think is going to be talking about a topic that'll be relevant for so many of our listeners. It's a topic that we haven't discussed, I don't believe, before on the Family Renewal Podcast, and it is the topic of how to deal with tragedy and difficulty when it hits your family. And our guest is uniquely qualified to speak about that because she has experienced a whole lot of that on a lot of different levels in her own personal life. She is author and conference speaker, Kerry Tittle, who is also the founder of a ministry called Refined Families. And Kerry, welcome to the Family Renewal Podcast.
Thank you, Israel. Thank you for having me.
Well, I first found out about your family some years back because, and you probably don't remember this, but we were at a homeschool convention. I think it was in Indianapolis, and our ministry booth was right across from yours. And as I recall the event, it was a typical kind of large conference where I don't think we ever even got to say hi. But I noted your business, your family business, and noted your family working together in that family business. And so it was kind of one of the first times when it really registered or kind of got on my radar about who you were. And then the next thing that I had heard was that your life took a pretty dramatic turn. So can you kind of give us your backstory as far as the family business that the Lord gave you guys and that you were working in, and then how things took a very different direction for you?
Sure. I do remember that. I do remember that conference, and it was in Indianapolis. It was like a February, I think. And we had a small kind of a startup business. It was ReformationKidz. I just had a love for Reformation history, and I had written a book on John Calvin. And so we were just kind of starting, and I had all 9 of my kids there, including I think he was 3 months old, 4-month old baby. And yeah, so that was our last convention, actually. And in April of 2014, our home was destroyed by an F4 tornado, and I had lost my husband and 2 of my daughters in that storm. And yeah, it was it was a life changing. It was we lost you know, minor things like the business and the home and stuff like that. But more importantly, I lost quite a bit of my family.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Our family the last 3 years has been through some challenges as well. I don't have to tell our story, but we had 4 children diagnosed with Lyme disease, and then we ended up having to be forced out of our home because of mold and just a bunch of other things I won't even have time to get into. But one of the things that people asked us when we went through that is, how do you make it? When you feel like everything is falling apart, when you feel like you don't have anything left to hold on to, how do you survive something like that? How do you continue to get up and go through each day? And how do you just continue to press forward? And I guess one thing that I noticed about our family was that our our belief in God, our theology, what we know to be true about God, was, I think, everything for us in that. What would you say for you in terms of the suffering that your family had to go through? How important was it for you to have a foundation laid about your understanding of God before all that happened?
Sure. Um, it's pretty interesting because um, I was, and I mean, I don't mean this lightly. I mean, seriously, I was deeply rooted in legalism. And when the tragedy happened, I knew all the right answers. I
Hmm.
knew what was true. I knew but there was a part of me that kept performing. I kept jumping in to perform. And a lot of that was, I couldn't feel at that time. That first
Right.
year, I couldn't feel. There was a
Right.
lot of shock. And
Right.
just because I was so used to that legalistic lifestyle, I just worked and worked and worked and worked and worked. And this is a journey that the Lord has taken me on about, anytime somebody talks about the sovereignty of God, Christians will always say, well, of course I believe in the sovereignty of God. That's what we do. But there was a part of me that's like, yes, I believe in the sovereignty of God, but I've got to do everything I can and to fix this all myself. And I had a very noisy soul. I just went 90 to nothing constantly. And I feel like the Lord and had to just slow me down
Hmm.
to because I would say that my foundation in theology, I mean, it was everything, but at that certain time, I was just, my mind was everywhere else. And in 2019, I had a bilateral stroke to both sides of my brain. And the Lord, I do believe that this is just part of the journey that the Lord has brought me on to um, to reflect, like Psalm 91, where we are abiding in the shadow of the Almighty, and in the Most High. And um, He has taught me through all of this to be quiet and to be still and to trust. And I would say to anyone who's going through a difficult time, yes, we know all the, God works all things together for good of those who love him. And we know that we need to trust God. And we know all those things. And I think that's important. And we need to hold to what we know. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. We need to hold to what we know, because there's going to be a time you just don't feel like it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't have said that better. And I think, it is typical in situations of trauma for anyone who's studied what happens in trauma, where you go through phases and cycles of it, where, like you say, you're kind of numb to it. It hasn't really sunk in yet. You sometimes can't grieve,
Mm.
even though you should. Sometimes you feel guilty for not grieving in the way that you think you should grieve. Sometimes some people have times of grief where, they just feel like they are never going to see anything with a positive light ever again. And as a Christian, I think it can be very difficult when you go through what are kind of natural and normal processes of grief and trauma recovery,
Mhm.
because I think there's an expectation that a lot of people have that Christians are just always supposed to be happy, and they're always supposed to have a smile on their face, and they're not supposed to admit if they're having struggles or difficulties. Did you struggle with some of those things, in
Oh
your
my goodness.
process?
Oh my goodness. Yes. We had flashbacks. We had um my children, apparently, obviously, a lot of those are their stories to tell, but we went through some really, really dark valleys. We and what was interesting is the pre-storm Kerry would have told you, you're just not loving God enough, or you're not this enough, or you're not that enough. And then I was on the other side of the table, where I was experiencing depression and terrifying dreams and afraid a lot. And so absolutely, I've been through much of that, and I've tried to blog much of that on my website as possible. Some of those um, experiences that I've gone through.
Yeah, that journey. Your story is so similar to Job's story in the
Yeah.
Bible in so many ways. And I've often felt that, as the enemy attacked Job, he attacked him physically, which you've experienced, with these strokes and in your own physical body. He attacked him, financially. He attacked him in so many different ways. But I don't know that there is a pain that a person can experience. And I've never experienced the loss of a spouse, so I don't know what that's like. But I don't know that there is a pain that a parent can experience that, or a person can, that is like when something happens to your child. There's
Hmm.
just something that, when you have a loss of a child, or you have even a child who is suffering and you don't know how to fix it, you don't know how to help. And I've always just felt that there's kind of a level of cruelty that the
Hmm.
enemy of our souls goes to in attacking our children that is just so, outside the boundaries, outside the
Hmm.
rules. There's a sense in which, okay, fine, hit me, right?
Hmm.
Do what you want to me, but don't touch my kids.
Right.
Leave my kids out of this, and so as a parent, like, the thought is, we want to protect our kids from everything. We never want anything bad to ever happen to our children. To some extent, that's probably why a lot of us move toward homeschooling and or Christian schools, or things like that. Like, we're trying to protect our children from negative influences or from harm or harmful ideas or whatever. And yet we also know, like, we can't entirely and completely protect our children. So what do you say as far as how we as parents can kind of prepare our children and protect them spiritually on the inside, if that makes sense, like to help prepare them for the difficulties that they'll face in life, because something
Hmm.
could happen to them that we can't control. What have you
Absolutely.
learned about that, just as far as, maybe what your families walk through, or how you have been able to have conversations with your children? I know we can't do it perfectly, but what are some thoughts that come to your mind as far as how we can help our children to deal with suffering in their own lives?
Sure. You know, that probably was my top concern when we were going through all this. I've always been able to control what happened to my kids, where they went to school, what they saw on TV, what they didn't. This I was not able to control. I couldn't take the pain away for them. And I didn't know how to explain it to them. Because like I said, I was a mess myself.
Mhm.
And I interesting enough, and this is kind of where refined families came from. I started studying about the refiner's fire. And as I learned how, something is um, comes from something, an ugly old, like a rock piece of ore can be turned into a masterpiece by what God has done. It began to click with me of I think it's James that says, don't be surprised. Don't be surprised when these trials come. And we were surprised. We were
We
not
always are.
prepared.
We
Yeah,
always
we
are.
don't think of that. And I didn't have a I didn't have a good way to help my children. And that which led to why I penned the book of Nugget, to explain why bad things happen in life like this, and um, kind of hope that you can have when you're in that refining fire and that cauldron or whatever, that there is still hope, and why we should have that hope.
That
So,
book, for those listeners who are not familiar with it, Carrie's written a children's book called Nugget and the Refiner, which is published by Reformation Heritage Books. And it's a children's book that parents can read aloud, or have their children read, that kind of helps them to think through that process and to
mhm,
realize the goodness of God, even in the midst of what seems like, uh, what is pain and suffering that he's allowing into our life, but things that are not good. But there's that tendency that we have to question the goodness of God
Yeah.
when evil and suffering are allowed into our life. And your book is an excellent resource for those families. We'll come back to it later, but people who want to get plugged in, like get that resource or want to get plugged in with what you do, tell them how they can get in contact with you and connect with what you do.
We have a website. It's refinedfamily.org. And pretty much, I've been asked to speak, at different churches and things like that. I just try to have resources out there that can help people because, when you're going through a trial, the first thing you're doing is you're looking for help. You're looking for something that's going to help, and quite honestly, Jesus is enough. I know that that's hard to hear when you're going through that. And I'm not on the other side, but at that time I was looking for a lot of resources as well. And I'm just hoping that website will, maybe help somebody in that way.
Yeah. So talk about how you got into developing the website and the ministry. Like, what were the things that God was stirring in your heart to help you to turn some of the pain and suffering that your family experienced into resources that could help others?
Sure. Well, honestly, it was an odd the tragedy went global. I mean, we
Mhm.
heard from people all over the world. And, I'm just a small country girl, from nowhere, Arkansas. And all of a sudden there was this limelight that I was overwhelmed with. And people just had a lot of questions. They had a lot of questions. They had, and I couldn't obviously answer all those questions. So I just began to write and post for, some of the questions that came into me. I would just write them down and try to answer them that way. Um, so that's just kind of how it began. It was never an intent to have a website or to this. It was all God, you know.
Well, people want to reach out to somebody who has walked in their shoes,
Mm-hmm.
because people who have never experienced tragedy, who have never experienced suffering, they tend to give a lot of cliche answers, things
Yes.
that might even be true.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but sometimes there's a way that you can receive something that's said from someone that's been where you are, that they're not saying it in a trite or cliche manner.
Right.
That there were times when I would gather my family, when we were really dealing with some of the most difficult aspects of our journey. And in the morning, we have Bible time. And I would just tell my children, this morning, we're going to worship God. And we're not going to worship God because we feel like it. We're going to worship God because he's good and
Yes.
because he's worthy. And, I had to show my children and lead my children into acts of faith and steps of obedience to God, that were rooted and grounded in who we knew he was. And so I think there were people who told us later that they were going through things and kind of watching on the outside to see how our family handled some of the difficulties that we went through. And they said how indirectly it spoke to them, and it kind of set a model for them of how you go through difficulties as a family. We didn't deny that the things were painful or difficult. We talked about
Right.
those things. We were open about those things. But I think that's something that we don't recognize as well, is that God never allows us to endure any pain or tragedy that he does not fully intend to redeem for his glory, for our ultimate good. It's not good in the time, but our
Right.
ultimate good, which is our sanctification, becoming like
Mm-hmm.
Christ, and then the good of others. And that good of others part is something that your family has experienced to some level, and I think will continue to as time goes on. that the things that God has taught you, the things that you've learned through this process, are things that He's going to continue to use you and your family in the lives of others, because God doesn't want us to waste our pain.
Mm.
I didn't intend to ask you this question, but I just would like to ask you. You mentioned about how in this process the Lord has helped you to work through issues of legalism. And boy, that's an issue I think none of us like to think of ourselves as being in that category. But can you talk a little bit about just what that looked like in your life and what that journey was like for you? How do you sort through that? Because what some people do is they just swing a pendulum swing way away in the other ditch, if you will, and abandon Christianity, and they deconstruct, and they call themselves an ex-evangelical and all
Mhm.
of that. And you haven't done that. But what's that journey been like for you?
Well, it's been very humbling because the Lord has um, taken away what I would have considered my own little kingdom. I was a homeschool mom with 9 kids, and we were, I wouldn't say, I don't know if we were pillars in the community or not, but people say that we were. I everybody was wearing dresses, and we did you know, we did God's word, the beginning of the day, the end of the day, we bookend the day with God's word, and we did Bible class in between, and all these things I thought, I think at the time, I really, really wanted to honor the Lord,
Mhm.
but I was adding more laws to our family, and just so we could be acceptable, to Him. And He has
To
stripped.
him or to your subculture?
Huh?
Were you doing those things to be acceptable to Christ, or did it be acceptable to your
Yeah.
subculture?
Oh, there's so much of that you want your kids to look good, in front whenever you're going out or whatever.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of pride in there as well. And after that, obviously the Lord stripped all that away. I was no longer a wife. I was no longer had this cute little homeschool family. I mean, our kids were a mess.
Mm.
And the interesting thing about trials is when that dross comes to the surface, it really exposes who you are.
Mm.
And I wasn't as spiritual as I thought I was,
Mm. Mm.
and but again, that's just part of the journey. But the journey up to now has been just the way that God and His loving kindness has just quietened my soul, and um, it's very peaceful. That I mean, I fought against Him for so long, was exhausted, and again, the stroke is what really made me turn to just being held, just allowing Him to hold me, and not fighting for I've got to do this myself, that myself, because I was very self-sufficient sort of person. And people who knew me then, who see me now, will tell you she is just a really different person, you
Mm.
know. And um yeah, that's all God's doing.
It's interesting that I think a lot of people who went through what you experienced would come out on the other side and say, I don't love God. He's not good. I can't trust him.
Mhm.
And that was not your experience.
No, it really wasn't. And I really can't remember a time that um, I just turned my back on him. I really can't remember that. I still, um, now there was a time that I, um, I was at the cemetery actually, and I was sitting on my car, and this is probably the most obstinate I'd been with him, but I just said, I'm not leaving here till you show up. because I really felt like God had left me. I had felt, like I was in this wilderness, which even in the children's book, you will find that even in those dark times, he never leaves you.
That's right.
He never forsakes you. He's always there. And I've also, this is also on the website too, but I just remember saying, I'm still here, like an hour later. And I just remember those words just hanging in the air of I'm still here, because it was like my own pointing my finger at God was like, yeah, he is still here. And that was a very humbling moment for me, because he's never once left us. And I can't remember one time in the last 9 years that I've needed something that God has not provided. So yeah.
Your story is so encouraging to me, because I know several other families who have had similar experiences, and it wrecked them. It wrecked their faith, and they did not emerge on the other side of it with a deeper understanding of God and who he was. They just bailed. And I think part of it was that their view of God and their understanding of God was that they needed to come to Jesus so that he could solve all their life's problems, and so that bad things wouldn't happen to them and tragedy wouldn't happen to them, because Jesus would put a bubble around them and protect them. I think that was really probably the version of the gospel that they heard and that they embraced, and that they accepted, and they kind of cut a deal with God. Okay, God, I'm in. You take care of me, you protect me, you don't let anything bad happen to me, and I'll follow you. And then when that didn't happen, they didn't know where to go from there, because that was their version of God. And I can see how that would shatter you, if that really is what you think God's primary objective is to make sure that bad things don't happen to us. And yet, we live in a sinful, fallen world, and sometimes through no fault of our own, through no sin of our own, tragedy strikes and bad things happen. And I think it's that understanding of who God is, and that he does love us even when we don't get the explanation. Job didn't get the explanation. I'm guessing to a great extent you haven't gotten that explanation either. I mean, feel free to explain if you have, but usually we don't get an answer to the why question, do we?
No, and there's plenty of Bildad and all those guys out there that want to help, but no. And I think that goes back to your initial question of having that foundation. If you have a solid biblical foundation, you're going to know that those prosperity messages are not in there, that it's not, and it's not that God doesn't love you, but that thing of you're never going to feel trials or whatever.
You never get sick.
It's quite the opposite. It tells you to expect them and to be ready. So yeah. And my son, I remember my son saying, he said, Mom, he said, it just seemed to me that you waited to put on the armor until you were in the middle of the battlefield. I remember him telling me that.
Oh, wow.
And so, because I wasn't ready. We weren't ready.
That's interesting. Wow.
So, yeah.
At least you knew where the armor was and how to put it on, right?
Yeah, quickly, But
wow, that's insightful.
So yeah.
Interesting. So you're, and I didn't prepare to ask you this either, but you're entering a little new season with a project that you've embarked on that I'm pretty excited about. You live in the state of Arkansas, and Arkansas is a state that, unlike many other states in the United States, has never had a homeschool convention that is its own state, homeschool convention. Teaching them diligently was in, I am thinking of all the wrong names now. Where Rogers, that's
Rogers,
right.
yes.
Rogers, Arkansas. And so they had a conference there for a few years, and they're not doing one there currently. But the Lord laid something on your heart to help bring a homeschool conference to Arkansas. Are you at liberty to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. It's always been in my heart, but I will tell you that my husband and I had this conversation probably about 10, 11 years ago about having a homeschool conference here. But now I just see the need now more than it's ever been. We have a lot of new people that have moved to Arkansas. We've had a lot of new homeschoolers, and they don't know what, I mean, this is a new journey, and I don't remember what it was like to begin homeschooling, because I guess I've always done it, but it's a scary step to go to something so drastic and new. And there's no reason to, to be terrified of that. And then I picked up a book a couple years ago that dealt with the, Horace Mann and John Dewey. And all of a sudden I was just burdened, I guess is the word I could say, is there was just, I don't know, it was just so much evilness going on. And I remember in my own journey is I was afraid my kids were going to fall behind. That was always my big fear, is they would fall behind. And I never asked myself who fall behind who. I never asked myself that. I just didn't
Right.
want to fall behind.
Right.
And when I started, really reading and studying the progressive movement, it kind of lit a fire there. And I'm pretty excited to be able to bring, resources to Arkansas for these families.
So if somebody lives in or near Arkansas and they're interested in attending the conference, or maybe they have a publishing company, they want to go as a vendor or something like that, how can they get information on the conference?
So we are, I have somebody working right now on the website, and it should be up probably about 5 weeks is our goal. And our first we're going to do some online things this year, but our first conference will be June 28th, 2024. And it's CHESARK, CHESARK, for Christian Home Educators Summit of Arkansas. And they will be able to go to that website and sign up to be a vendor or just to register for the conference.
So they should be able to Google CHESARK,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe find it on Facebook, go search for it on Facebook, or Google to find the website. And I'm excited that you're doing that. I think there's a great need for that. So are you still doing conference speaking? Like if somebody wants to have you come speak at their women's event or their conference, how can they get in touch with you?
Through Refined Family at this point. So refinedfamily.org, there's a contact us in the menu that they can, request me to speak. And I do, a handful a year, as, single mom life will allow me to.
Sure,
So,
absolutely. Well, I'm going to ask you to do something kind of unique here to close the podcast. I'm going to ask you to pray, and just to think about a family, a mother, a parent who is just dealing with tragedy in her own family life, and that could be any number of things. But she's at a place right now where she doesn't really know which way to look, and she doesn't feel that God is for her right now. She does not see the goodness of God in this moment. She just feels a lot of pain and maybe feels abandoned. I would like you to pray for that mom, pray for that parent, that you can just speak from the things that God has taught you and shown you, and pray for some life and hope and encouragement for that mom. Let's just pray if you would lead us.
absolutely. Thank you. Gracious Father, we do thank you for this ministry, Family Renewal, that can go to the listeners across the nation, Lord. And there are so many people that we're rubbing elbows with that are in trials, and moms that have just lost heart. Lord, I just pray that we can be like the friends in the young man in Matthew, where they lowered him to the feet of Jesus through the ceiling. Lord, that we can take her to you, that we can bring her to you when we're just too weak to do it ourselves. And Lord, I just pray that you will give, that you will use whoever Israel has as guests and be able to encourage these hurting hearts, Lord. I thank you that we can come before the throne of grace. I thank you that you bid us to come when we're hurt, when we have no words, when we don't understand, that that you're there for us, Lord, and that you will never leave us and that you will never forsake us. Lord, I do pray that you will just touch those hearts today that are just struggling, and that they will find hope in you, and that you will just call them to yourself, Lord. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much for doing that. And thank you, listeners, for being willing to once again listen to an episode. But I hope this has been an encouragement to your heart. And again, please reach out for refinedfamily.org and contact Kerry if you have questions. If you want some good resources, you'll be able to enjoy her blog. Definitely pick up a copy of her book, Nugget and the Refiner. And if you're looking for a speaker, I would highly recommend her. So thank you guys for listening, and look forward to next time. Kerry, thank you for being our guest.